Good afternoon, everyone. We are giving folks just a few minutes to come into the room and get settled. We should start right around maybe a little after 2, just turned 2:01. So let's start about 2:02 just to let folks get into the room. All right. Well, looks like our numbers have stabilized a bit, so we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us. We are now at the 8th installment of our rulemaking meeting series. I'm Ariel Finney. I'm the Law Cares Fund Policy and Rules Manager, and I'm joined today by Vicki Bouvier, our Law Cares Fund Workforce Policy Manager. We're part of the Department of Social and Health Services, Law Cares or Washington Cares Fund team working on rulemaking for a new chapter of Washington Administrative Code. Each meeting, we're focusing on specific topics related to rulemaking, and today we'll be focusing on provider registration. We will be only addressing rulemaking for the Department of Social and Health Services. The Employment Security Department is also doing rulemaking, so please reach out to Employment Security Department if you're interested in their rulemaking activities. So our agenda is up on the screen for those of you who are returning from and you've been in other presentations that we've done. This is going to be following the same format where we're going to be doing some housekeeping, common terms. We'll do some registration. We'll do a brief presentation by Vicki on registration basics and provider registration. And then we will use the rest of our time for discussion where I have a few questions to kick us off with your participation, get some ideas from the folks who are here in the room. If you have been with us before, much of this will look very similar here in the beginning with those housekeeping common terms, but I always like to make sure that we're starting from a shared space of understanding when it comes to what to expect from this session, but also some common terms. We are scheduled for 2 hours, but we're consistently running closer to 1 hour. So I expect we will be wrapping up earlier than scheduled. We do have plenty of time for discussion, but typically we like to keep the discussion kind of in its natural state. And if things start getting quiet, we'll go ahead and close up. So some housekeeping before we begin. We do have the question and answer feature available for questions throughout the presentation today. We will do our best to address questions as we go. However, we do have a set presentation section, and we'll likely save our question and answers to the end of that. Some questions, though, we may need to follow up with you separately or may be more general program questions, in which case we do have some resources I'm going to share about where to direct those general program questions. The chat will be disabled during the presentation, but for our discussion portion of the presentation the discussion portion of our session today, we will make the chat available so you can participate through chat. We also will allow folks to raise their hand and come off mute if you'd like to participate in that way. The webinar or the session we're part of today is being recorded and it will be made available on the Washington Cares Fund website, which is up on the screen here. We have recordings of all of our past ones as well as the ones that we have coming up. I see I do have a typo here that it says June 12th. That should say June 26th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Will be our next session. We'll be talking about provider deregistration and termination. Today's focus is on provider registration requirements. So if you're interested in provider deregistration and termination, we will be covering that June 26th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Our purpose of the meeting today is to hear ideas from you all about rulemaking. We are just beginning our initial drafts of rules and want to hear the values of our community so we can integrate that feedback into our initial drafts. Our focus today is on rulemaking and hearing your ideas and recommendations. In order to remain focused on the purpose of our meeting, we will not be addressing any program-related questions. If you have questions about the WACARES Fund program, please email wacares@dshs.wa.gov, and our customer care team members will assist in answering your questions. So again, just as a summary here, we really want to hear from you all today. The main, value of this whole session is to hear from you and get ideas so we can start using that when it comes to rulemaking. And it's really helpful for us to hear that feedback early on and use that as some guiding principles for what we draft. So know that your contributions today are valued. We appreciate them. We will be considering them as we draft. So please feel free to engage in that discussion section when we get to it. Some common terms that I want to go over if this is your first time here. I just want to make sure that you are familiar with some of the terms we're going to be using. Terms that may not be on this list here that we may use just as kind of natural language that comes up in this field, I will do my best to explain as we go. So if you're not sure about a term, please feel free to ask the question, but I will also be asking questions to make sure I have the right understanding of any sort of abbreviation or acronym that's used. So we'll start off with the Department of Social and Health Services. That is who we are representing today. We're part of the Department of Social and Health Services, and the Department of Social and Health Services is the lead on the Washington Cares Fund project. This meeting series is focused on the work being done with the Department of Social and Health Services. You will commonly hear the Department of Social and Health Services referred to as DSHS. Employment Security Department also has a major role in this project. The Employment Security Department is leading the work on employee contributions. You will commonly hear the Employment Security Department referred to as ESD. Healthcare Authority is the third department responsible for a major part of the Washington Cares Fund program. They're responsible for the payment system, verifying use of benefits, and establishing criteria for payment of benefits to providers. You will commonly hear the Healthcare Authority referred to as HCA. Long-term services and supports, or LTSS, refers to a variety of services and resources to assist people who experience a long-term disability to maintain their safety and comfort. Today, we're going to be talking about long-term services and supports providers being registered to become providers for beneficiaries for the Washington Cares Fund program. So long-term services and supports will likely be used throughout today. The Revised Code of Washington, or RCW, refers to the statute or the language enacted by the legislature. These are the laws that provide program direction, limitation, and grant permission to state agencies for rulemaking. You've already heard me use the term Washington Cares Fund, or interchanging it with WACARES Fund. We use both. I think most naturally we're using WACARES at this point, but that is representing the Washington Cares Fund. You also may see WACARES Fund or WACARES or Washington Cares Fund referenced as WCF. Washington Administrative Code, or WAC or WAC, we most commonly refer to it as WAC, are rules developed by government agencies to implement policies and procedures as delegated by the legislature. You may also hear WACs referred to as rules or regulations. When I refer to rulemaking, it's regarding developing or amending Washington Administrative Code, or WAC. So with that, we've gotten through our housekeeping and our common terms. I'm going to turn it over to my partner here, Vicki, to take us through registration basics.
And thank you for attending this virtual meeting. Very much appreciate your participation. As Ariel said, I am the WACARES Fund Workforce Policy Manager, so I'll be working with the other staff to draft the rules for registration. And this conversation is set up to go over the basic components of the registration requirements as established in our statute, as well as the process framework for registration of providers. Next slide, please. So the statute that directs DSHS to register providers is 50B.04.020 sub 3. And you can see here that subsection C says that DSHS must register providers that meet minimum qualifications. And then sub D establishes the terms under which a provider would be deregistered, and failing to meet the minimum qualifications is one piece of it, or violating operational standards of the program is the other avenue for deregistration. Next slide, please. The statute, that same statute, in subsection E, requires the department to disperse payments of benefits on behalf of the beneficiaries to registered WellCares providers. Next slide, please. So what is registration? It is the simplest form of license under chapter 35.04 RCW. And that is the statute. It's called the Administrative Procedure Act. And it's the requirements state agencies have to follow in order to adopt licensing requirements. And those adoptions are done in Washington Administrative Code, or WAC, and often called rule. And the registration specifically grants an approved provider to, in the case of WellCares, provide services to WellCares beneficiaries. Next slide, please. In conjunction with the registration under 3405, WellCares also must contract with providers in order for that relationship between the beneficiary and the provider to be established, and also for a relationship between the department and the provider, so that beneficiaries can approve services that a provider offers, and the department can disperse payments to the provider after services have been rendered. The contract also allows for the department to set up monitoring of the contract and combine the process of registration and contracting through that monitoring process. Next slide, please. Registration with the contract is what we're doing. So the license plus the contract as a single connected administrative function. And again, the registration approves a provider to provide a particular service, and within the registration requirements that we'll be establishing in rule, there are also a requirement to have a contract. And the contract, again, provides the framework to issue payments to providers on behalf of beneficiaries. Next slide, please. So those are the components of the registration and contract combination. And the next slides will go over the elements of the process that it's a high-level framework for the process, and we'd like very much to get your feedback on this piece as well. Next slide, please. So this again is our statute that requires us to register providers that meet minimum qualifications in law, and then also to deregister providers who don't meet the minimum qualifications or the operational standards of the program. Now, minimum qualifications established in the law is pretty standardly the professional license that allows the provider to offer the service. So an example of that is an adult family home with a DSHS issued license, or a nurse, a registered nurse who has a Department of Health license. Another example would be, say, for a provider who doesn't have a long-term care specific license or a health specific license. They might be a vendor of, say, adaptive equipment for beneficiaries, and those providers would operate under a master business license issued from the Department of Licensing. And then the deregistration is where you see the reference to operational standards, and those are things that have to be adopted in rules so that providers know what operational requirements they're expected to follow while they're registered. And those standards can include things like using, well, the contract for one in general, but also using the payment system that we're called Provider One that the Healthcare Authority maintains. Next slide, please. So for minimum qualifications, the provider must have a valid license, as we talked about. The provider of both the owner and staff would have to pass criminal history background checks. That's required under RC or Chapter 43.43 RCW, and that is the background check statutes for providers of services to vulnerable adults. So those who have unsupervised access to vulnerable adults would have to have a name and date of birth background check done by the State Patrol, as well as a fingerprint background check performed by the FBI. Owners often only get the name and date of birth background check because they don't have direct unsupervised access with clients, beneficiaries. So in addition to those two things, a provider would also need to have an active contract with WellCares, and then agree to following the operational standards that are set by the program. Next slide, please. So the operational standards will be adopted in rules so that it's very clear what it is that's expected and what you must comply with in order to maintain your registration. And here's a list of some of the operational standards that will be adopted, and they include things like more complex things like holding liability insurance to more simple actions such as cooperating with monitoring activities. There are some critically important things that we view them all as critically important, of course. But some that I wanted to point out are we're anticipating setting a standard for providers to submit payment claims requests within 60 days of service. And another important one is for notifications to the department of certain things, such as when a beneficiary passes away, when there's a change of ownership to the business that's registered, or to just notify the department if the provider no longer meets qualifications because they've chosen not to renew their license or they've chosen to drop their contract. Next slide, please. So the registration process is pretty step by step. It's pretty straightforward. So the applicant would complete the application, include proof of meeting minimum qualifications. We talked about some of those examples, and then providing the documentation necessary to obtain the contract. Now, we are anticipating combining those things into a single application to make it as efficient and be able to process the applications for both the registration of the license as well as the contract through the same application process and move it through the process. From there, staff would contact applicants if any questions arose or if additional documentation was necessary, and for signatures for contracts, so that at the end of the process, the applicant, if approved, would be both contracted and registered at the same time. As part of that process, you'd also complete a background check, and there are 3 responses from the background check. One is no findings, so the applicant has no criminal history. One would be disqualified, and the list of disqualifying crimes for this program will be found in chapter 388-113 WAC, and there's a finite list of those crimes that would make a person ineligible to be a provider. And then the third result that can be that can come up is a review required result. And that means that the applicant has a finding on their background check that is not disqualifying, but we are obligated under statute to do something that's called a character competency and suitability review. And those will all be conducted by WACARE's staff. And the results of those would be used in the decision-making for the registration decision. As part of the process, the applicant would obtain the DSHS contract. And then once registered, the provider would be listed on our Community Living Connections website. And beneficiaries are directed to that website to be able to select the services they need or see the services they need, and see which providers are available for those services. Next slide, please. So that is the end of my portion of the presentation, and I'll hand it over to Ariel.
Thank you. And thank you for running us through the basics of registration, as well as the registration process as it stands today. I have opened up the chat, so we are going to be kicking off our discussion portion here. You are welcome to use the chat. You are also going to be welcome to raise your hand, and I will unmute you, and you can participate in that way. I do ask that folks are just aware of time. If you're coming off of mute, to be respectful of other folks that want to also be heard, and also making sure we leave plenty of space for dialogue for everyone. So with that, let's get us started on our first discussion question. We start off with the question up here on your screen. When thinking of a provider registration process, what would you recommend? And again, that's when thinking of a provider registration process, what would you recommend? And while you're thinking about that, I am going to drop some links in the chat, just so folks already have these as we go along. One of which is going to be the DSHS website for WACARE's fund rulemaking. You'll be able to click on that and see past presentations as well as future presentations. We have the Employment Security Department website, the Healthcare Authority website, and those are both rulemaking websites. And then also where to direct program-related questions, and also how to reach out to me directly after this presentation if you have any ideas you want to share or questions there. So Brian has a question saying, are adult day programs, not day health, supportable via WACARE's funding? And I do believe we're looking at that under approved services, that we do have the adult day programs being considered there. So I hope that helps, Brian. And again, the question we want to be thinking about is, when thinking of a provider registration process, what would you recommend? All right, and I see Brian kicking us off here with something similar to current contract processes. That helps. That does help. Thank you so much. And to clarify, are we talking about Medicaid contract processes? I'm guessing so, but I don't want to assume. So if you wouldn't mind clarifying, are we talking about Medicaid contract processes? And Katie's asking, how long is the projected turnaround time for a provider? We are still considering that. We talked about it in our last one of these sessions here a few weeks ago, so this is going to be a small plug to go back and look at that. And if you have ideas, please send them my way. It's never too late to contribute to the past discussions. But we're still looking at what would the timeline be for a registration process to be completed? Where would the cutoff be? And I think the general consensus when we talked about this in our discussions last round was somewhere between 30 and 90 days, recognizing that too much time, things can start kind of losing momentum, but also too little time, and it's hard to meet that deadline. So the general consensus from our last discussion was around 30 to 90 days, probably split the difference around 60 somewhere, but still very much being discussed and being worked through, but very open to ideas if you have any. Brian clarified here from the past question around something similar to current contract processes, saying we do both Medicaid and Older Americans Act funding contracts, so either way. Thanks for clarifying that, Brian. That's really helpful. What else? When thinking of a provider registration process, what would you recommend? And this is a really, we're gathering this information just for context as you're thinking, but we're gathering this information as a way of kind of helping us understand what are some things to consider. Of course, we're spending a lot of time and putting a lot of discussion together as far as a registration process, but also recognizing that everybody's going to have a different perspective in this. And it's really helpful for us to hear that as we're thinking about, the impact of different processes. So very curious to hear thoughts from those who are in the room here today. I think, it ties directly back into the work we're doing around drafting. So this is a great opportunity, I think, if you have any ideas on this, please share. We're happy to hear them. So I see a question came in regarding requirements for family caregivers. And that, I believe, is being discussed in the commission. I don't know if it's a work group or not, but I know our commission has been focusing some discussions around that, but I'm not too sure about the timing. So I'm hoping Vicki may be able to help support that answer. Brian said, I recommend that there be a single big registration covering 4 years with more simple annual renewals. The current social services contracts through the AAA are distributed across multiple regions, each with its own contract. Is it possible to consolidate these into a single contract for the entire state? Managing multiple contracts and timelines is challenging for small businesses. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Dan and Brian. I think that's both great. Both comments are great to hear, just as things for us to be considering. I am curious if either of you, but particularly Dan, would feel comfortable just explaining more about the impact of having multiple contracts so we can kind of understand current state just a bit more. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, if not, that's okay. But just curious about the impact of multiple contracts and timelines and how that impacts your small business. And Dan, if you want to raise your hand, I can work on unmuting you. There we go. All right, you should be able to unmute now.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry, I was trying to talk into space. Yeah, so currently throughout obviously the state, there are different regions for both home community services as well as the area agency on aging contracts. And these contracts are let to, agencies and companies, at different timeframes. So there are obviously very strict requirements, and as you have outlined, and managing all those in the different contracts and the different contracting managers, times will up to possibly 10 or 13. It's a bit of a burden, quite frankly, and making sure the certificates of insurance and all the different pieces and parts, background checks, and when you go through these monitorings, I'm assuming there's going to be monitorings. It just to consolidate it and by the way, all these 13 contracts in a sense all have the same exact language. So one single contract and this is just my personal opinion, what might help streamline efficiencies and really just help us deliver better services to people in the community, and focus on delivery of services and less the, we'll say, paperwork side of the business. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. That was really helpful to hear, and good to know the impact of those multiple contracts and how that, how you have to manage that. So wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Dan. All right, in the chat, I see Katie said, I second Dan and Brian's comments. Having clients located on the boundary of counties for Medicaid and knowing services are available nearby but are outside of the contracted region is challenging and would be a miss for service access by WellCare's consumers. So awesome. All right, good to hear that as well. Always good to know kind of the impact of current state and other programs and how that's working. So thanks for sharing. I think that's really helpful. So we're kind of already starting to talk about this next question. And so I'm going to put it up on the screen, but knowing we can toggle between both. So just because I've moved on doesn't mean we can't keep talking about a registration process, but we're kind of talking quite a bit about contracting because that's our current state. So I'm going to open the question up, but feel free to answer either one. This question is very similar, but says, when thinking of a provider contracting process, what would you recommend? And we've already heard about some of the impacts of the current Medicaid contracting service system, as well as the Older Americans Act, and the different boundaries that come up when it comes to contracted region. So that's good to hear. And I think that likely overlaps quite a bit, but I, again, will open it up to see if folks have any thoughts when we talk about contracting specifically. The challenge I think that comes up in this discussion is we're really talking about both at any time, because we have this registration requirement, but to make sure people get paid, we have a contracting requirement. And our hope is to really closely align these two things, but they are inherently different. We have different chapters to look to in statute, little bit of different requirements within that, just because they're really two different processes. But the hope is to kind of mush them together as much as we can, while being respectful of the fact that they are different processes, but thinking about the provider impact and also making sure that as a program, we can keep track of all the pieces there. So open the question up to you all. When thinking of a provider contracting process, what would you recommend? Our previous question was, when thinking of a provider registration process, what would you recommend? And both of those questions are open for answers. So Brian said we are funded almost entirely through our area agency on aging via different contracts. Could our AAA be the one to do the contract and be the conduit for our application as a nonprofit providing the service? Wonderful. All right, that's a great idea to be bringing in AAAs who are already doing some of that work. And I know we, as a program, have been working very closely with our partners over at the Area Agency on Aging, trying to figure out how to make sure that this, works well with those that are already contracted with Area Agency on Aging's. Right, I'll give folks just another few seconds here with this question. Again, I think we've touched on it, so I'm not too worried, but I am curious if you have any more thoughts, please share. All right. Well, if you're typing, keep typing. That's okay. If a thought comes to you later on during this discussion, add it into the chat. But also know you can always reach out to me after these presentations are over and share ideas as well. So just because we don't get to it now does not mean it still won't be considered. But we will move on to our next discussion question just to get this marinating with you all. Our next question is, what operational standards would you recommend to maintain the integrity of service provision? So Vicky gave us a brief overview of operational standards before with some examples of what those could be, such as liability insurance, notifying the department of an address change. There's a few other ones in there that I will navigate us back here in just a second to show those examples. But one more time for the question. The question is, what operational standards would you recommend to maintain the integrity of service provision? And I'm going to scroll back for just a second just to put those up on the screen for you. So some examples are notifying the Department of Address change or the liability insurance, cooperating with monitoring activities, submitting payment claim requests within 60 days of service, using Provider One to submit pre-authorizations, notifying the department if a beneficiary passes away or has a major incident during service provision, notify the department of changes in ownership, notify the department if no longer meeting the minimum qualifications, and then reporting any sort of suspected abuse, abandonment, neglect, or financial exploitation to Adult Protective Services and law enforcement when applicable. So really that last one speaking to mandated reporter requirements. So these are some examples of operational standards, but curious what else would be important, or what do you think even on this list is very important to think about when it comes to service integrity and the program as a whole. So I'll leave these up on the screen for just a second longer, and then we will go back to our question. But curious what you all think about what kind of operational standards should be put in place for the program. Yeah, so there's a question about pre-authorization process. And really this is going to be the relationship in Provider One for providers to be able to submit what we're calling pre-authorizations, but they are ways of kind of saying this is how much the service will be, and making, submitting that within Provider One for payment. So that's what that term's reflecting. We are still working on so many details there. So curious, as always, if you have ideas, please feel free to share. But when we talk about submitting pre-authorizations, it's submitting that essentially kind of the invoice in Provider One to say this is how much the services will be, this is how much it'll cost, this is how many units, and that way Provider One can pay up. I'm going to navigate us back to our question, which is, what operational standards would you recommend to maintain the integrity of service provision? All right, I think I may have stumped y'all on this question, which is okay. But super curious though, if anything is coming to mind when we think about operational standards. As Vicki mentioned before, these are things that will be in rule. We will be drafting our WACs for that. And so really curious what folks would think about the operational standards and just what kind of feedback that you would want us to be considering. And while you're thinking about that, I'll move us on to the next question, which is maybe going to help us think through through the same question in a different way, which is what operational standards would you recommend be excluded and why? And this may be just an easier way of approaching this topic around what should not be included and why should they not be included. All right, and I see Katie has a question regarding pre-authorization payment bullet. Would these providers be using the same access method to provider one as Medicaid 1099 providers currently use, or will there be a WellCare specific billing portal? And I will say, Katie, that is beyond my knowledge on this one, and it pains me to admit something like that, but I am not as familiar with Provider One and particularly Medicaid 1099 providers. So that is a great question. If you are curious about it, that I would say send over to our WellCares customer care team at wellcares@dshs.wa.gov. They'll be able, I think they'll be able to route to the right answer there, or at least give you a general idea of when we'll have an answer for a question like that. That I'm not too sure off the top of my head. So again, you can reach out to the WellCares customer care team and they may be able to help. We will be working through a lot of these details as we go though. But again, I'm just not sure. I just don't have the answer on that one. All right, and I see a follow-up to that is just that the process for billing or pre-auth needs to be simple and would be a real risk as a barrier for services. Okay, that's great to hear. Is there anything in particular that you're feeling concerned about there, or that kind of another way of thinking about it, is there anything that's currently happening today that you think would be something you would want different in the future, or for WellCare's program? And so Katie's working on that question. The question we're working on right now is what operational standards would you recommend be excluded and why? The alternative to that question that you're welcome to talk about as well is what operational standards do you think should be included and why? And Dan said, referring to my previous question, I have a suggestion that could save time and money while reducing errors when client information changes. Specifically, I aim to minimize the time spent by both case managers and providers and reporting these changes to the network of providers. As you know, even a simple update often results in numerous phone calls, emails, and time-consuming searches for both the provider and the case manager. That could help streamline the process. Wonderful, thanks, Dan. That's great to hear. All right. Well, I'm not seeing anything regarding operational standards. At least we're not gaining too much traction. I am, unfortunately,